Hi everyone, welcome to session 3 for digital arts. This week we are looking at the concept of stylization and what it actually means to add a sense of style to your work, which is a really interesting word. When you think about it, like what do we actually mean by style? What is that? Well, I think the best way to understand it is it's this idea of the visual identity of your work being unique to that work. So when an audience looks at what you've created, they know that you are the person that's made it or that your studio has made it. And that's kind of the purpose of style. It's the reason that most people, even people who just have a passing interest in animation, are able to tell the difference between Disney and Studio Ghibli, for example. Or even things like the difference between networks as well. So it's not so much about the production studio, but there's a very clear difference in visual aesthetic between what you would see on Cartoon Network and what you would see on Nickelodeon. And that all comes down to style. So that's what we're going to explore today. And we're going to start by looking at the real basics. Now, I know that might sound like a strange thing to say because why would we look at the basics when we're supposed to be in an advanced class? But that really is because the basics are advanced. This is based on some really big caveats in your ability. There are things you should already be able to do. Um, you should already understand composition. You should be able to understand shape dynamics, which we're going to look at today. You should be able to draw. Um, I know that sounds strange, but I mean really draw. So this is not a class. This session is not about teaching you how to draw something. You should already be able to draw an object from observation and draw basic objects with no reference whatsoever. So you should already have all of these skills before we can even begin to think about stylization. Um, and then the other kind of big component, the fourth component, is form and structure. Now, what we mean by that is you should have the ability to look at an object and understand why it looks the way it does. What are its physical components that are required for that object to exist? Why is a car a certain shape? Why does it have to conform to certain rules in order for it to function? So what is its form and what is its structure? And understanding that there are certain rules that you can't break when you're designing objects. So these four things you have to just know, and that's before you can learn the basics of stylization. Okay, so composition, which we've already looked at in so many sessions, like where to place things. Shape dynamics, like how objects are designed and how to kind of understand their basic kind of form and their basic structure, but really in simplified terms. So when to use a circle versus when to use a square. That's what we mean by shape dynamics. Drawing skills, you should be able to draw from life. And then finally, you should understand why certain things are designed the way they are designed. Let's just go on the assumption that we've all got that stuff. That's fine. That's all nice and easy. Then we can start thinking about stylization. So I'm going to start by looking at kind of where we need style. So I'm going to step out of this. Once again, I am working on Procreate because that's what I'm limited to, and I know many of you as well are limited in what it is you are able to kind of work with. I'm just going to go and pick kind of one of the other designs or the other kind of sketches or drawings I was working on. Let's see what's in this file. I do a lot of like random doodles and stuff. So, okay, so I've got some kind of interesting stuff here. I've got a shot here which I was designing like a corner piece of a cliff. So this kind of corner edge of a cliff face, I did this kind of small compositional doodle. So this one's quite useful, quite interesting as a piece of design. I've got this one up here where I was looking at this idea of like these kind of quite intense geometric shapes breaking through a landscape. I've got that's far too complex. That was the car suspended under spider webs. I'm going to look at that. And then this one was a complex like perspective shot of like a meteor crash or like something crashing through from the from outer atmosphere into the earth and sort of the trench of dirt that it would maybe create. And I was sort of thinking about perspective. So I've got some interesting stuff there. And then on this layer, I was looking at like human placement in a market. We're not going to look at that today because we're not talking about people. And then this one, which is like I was kind of merging a sort of samurai kind of spaghetti western feel environment, but also kind of throwing in like this Hobbiton kind of like little underground doors, like doors under trees feel. So that was kind of another sketch I was working on. Now, all of these contain specific components that would need to be stylized. Even at this early stage, there are elements here that need to be stylized. So I mean, in this one alone, I'm just going to pull out like a green marker just so we can draw around it. You can see I've got, for example, I've got doors just here. I'm going to add another layer. So we've got doors here and just here that need to be we need to work out like what does a door look like for starters, how is that stylized, but actually the key component on this is this object here. There's a tree that I've drawn in, and trees are actually a really good starting point for stylization. Just to jump back to this one, this big component for this sketch just here, the area that needs stylization to be considered is this cliff face. So we've got this kind of enormous cliff face here that we need to think about that. Like what's the aesthetic, the visual aesthetic or the structural stylization of this object, because it's the dominant one in the shot. So what I'm getting at here is every piece of design, every kind of piece of concept work you do must have some kind of stylization attached to it. Here's a footbridge over a stream that I was kind of playing around with, this idea of like, so you've got just going to go like right to the top here and create a new layer. So we've got like a path that kind of comes down here, and then you've got the river is here, and then on this bridge. So we've got like this footbridge that needs to be stylized. I've got lots of vertical lines, so I've got a tree trunk just here that needs to be stylized, and I've also got these kind of vertical lines here which were like Spanish moss almost, that need to be stylized. It's also onto a beach head. I think when I was sketching this, I was this idea of like a river kind of breaking to a beach head. So we've got all of these kind of material here, like rocks and stuff, that all need to be designed and stylized. So within any image, there's so much material that we have to pay attention to. That's what we're going to start looking at today. So I'm going to do a bit of a walkthrough on the very, very basics of developing that kind of compositional material. I'm in the right place. Yep, right, back to the correct file. So let's start with the absolute basics, which in this case is fundamental shapes. Whatever you're drawing, and in this instance, what we're going to focus on, we are going to go to the very basics of this, and we're going to think about the idea of trees. Trees are going to be our focus. When we're thinking about like what a tree is, we have to take into account everything we've ever seen, so our observational knowledge. We have to understand its form and structure. What components does a tree have to have in order for it to be a tree? And then we need to think about its shape dynamics and how the different components of the tree all relate to one another. So we can start by thinking about this in the most basic terms, which is around fundamental shape language. The three most common shapes that we would look at, because they are the three most common shapes that we see. Go. It's probably my favorite trick of Procreate. So we've got squares, triangles, circles. And this is what we really will focus on with everything moving forward, is understanding how to use these three basic shapes, these three very instantly recognizable shapes within any of the stylization that we would apply. Now, the reason that we start with these shapes is because the one that we select and the one that we work with will become the cornerstone or even the foundations of all of the stylization that we would then apply through the rest of our design work. So once we kind of get this understanding of like what recognizing the three kind of fundamental shapes and their dynamics, we can start to play around with them. So for example, we've got 4 edges we've got three edges, and we've got a singular edge, just one kind of ad infinitum edge. So we know that. We also know that a square by design has equal lengths to each of its edges. A standard equilateral triangle would as well, and a sphere is perfectly spherical. Yeah, exact, identically measured degrees going all the way around. So once we've got those under our belt, we can then start thinking about, well, how do you kind of alter the shape dynamics of these objects? And the first thing we can do is we can start to manipulate the kind of clear rules that are set with their edge length. So, for example, and this, you know how to do this. You've been doing this since you were children. But just something as simple as saying, well, you can just alter this square ever so slightly to create a new shape, which is a rectangle. We can do the same with the triangle. We don't have to keep that equilateral shape. We can start altering length. Same here for this circle. We don't have to keep to that same rule. We can alter it slightly, and we can start to manipulate it. Then once we've thought about edges, we can start thinking about angles. Do we have to keep these kind of same angles? What if we start to think about like more trapezium shapes? How we can start to warp them and start to really think about the different ways they work. I know this sounds very, very basic, and really kind of low end. But actually, it's this level of thinking that is the beginning of really drilling down deep into the logic of the style that you have established and you're committing to for this piece of work. So our next phase is kind of, once we've started to think about that, we can start thinking about bending a few other of the rules as well. Like, why do the lines have to be straight? Can you not create something that's just softer? Does it always have to be that kind of really strict straight lines? Make that a bit smaller. Can we not start to soften them perhaps? Can we not go the other way? Can we not start to push them in a different direction? Sharpen them another way, perhaps. Can we start to kind of break the rules that establish that shape just by adding in some harder kind of components, just like a little pinch point there? That completely changes the dynamics of the shape, and we actually show how far we've traveled from the beginning shape. We've kind of created something very, very different. And then when we start combining those rules, that's where we start to get those really kind of interesting shapes. So what if we start creating something that's like soft, almost borrowing from the triangle slightly? Start to create a shape that's like sort of really soft. Not sure whether to make it asymmetric or not. So with this one, there's two kind of. So already I'm just starting from a square. So I'm keeping some of the rules, four edges, but then I'm starting to think, okay, what if one of the edges, kind of. So we've got like this kind of very, very asymmetric shape, perhaps. Still soft around those edges. I'll kind of blow this up a little bit. Same for this. Really like the idea of like a soft triangle, really, really soft triangle. Or a triangle that almost starts to mimic that soft circular shape. So it's starting to mimic this one. that's up here. So it's, really starting to push and play and twist and contort and start to like have fun with these basic shapes. So once we've done that, let's move on. Let's go to the next stage, and we'll kind of carry these forward a little bit. So the one I'm going to carry forward, you carry forward one of the square ones that were based off a square. I'm going to go with this one. Now the reason I'm going to go with this one is because I know that my starting point for this class was the trees, and I think this one's just lends itself to that level of design. So kind of what I've got here is the beginnings of that slightly rounded, but still relatively symmetrical. I'm not going for anything that's dangerously asymmetrical or anything like that. So still relatively symmetrical. So that's the shape I'm going to move forward with. Now I need to start making some clear decisions about the design of that shape, because that's a flat, that's a two-dimensional object. It's completely flat, and actually it doesn't have any real kind of definition in its design. So what I'll need to start doing now is start thinking about it in a three-dimensional capacity. Like if this object is round, how round? How round is it really? Is it super round? So I can start to sort of like think about like, all right, so that's like kind of the one that's in shadow, just to kind of add a little bit of depth to it. Yeah, and then if I were to view it like completely from below, like what does that look like? So if it's like this, for example, is that right, or is that too soft? Or is that too? Maybe it's more like that. So I'm starting to think about this like a true sort of three-dimensional shape. Now I've got soft edges on this as well, so I need to make sure that they stay relatively soft. Let's get rid of that bit. So I'm really just starting to sort of play around with yeah, kind of how this is made. What's its construction? Maybe looking at it from a slightly different angle. This is like from below, looking up at it at that really tight angle. So yeah, I'm just starting to get my head around. That's like maybe from a really kind of shallow angle. Yeah, just getting my head around like how this thing is made, how it works as a three-dimensional object. Because what I'm effectively doing at this stage is I am learning it. Yeah, I'm saying to myself like this is kind of how this object is designed. Because now I can start to think, okay, right, if this is how it's designed, like how can I apply this within a sketch or within a piece of design material? And that's the next step now, is we now need to start thinking, okay, if this is the shape and the kind of style template that I will use to build the concept work for whatever animation I'm creating, what does that mean when I start to apply it to a physical object? So this is just the shape guide. This is the shape I've chosen, and this is what I'm going to work from. And now I need to start to apply that to the actual object itself. So in this case, it's trees, wasn't it? Is what we've decided. So I'm going to head up a layer. Let's make these invisible, and then I'm going to start by just kind of planting one of my shapes in. I'm going to keep it flat for the moment. We are going to start thinking about it three-dimensionally again. Don't worry, but we got to keep kind of applying that rule. This is quite a unique insight as well. This kind of activity is a very unique insight into the world of being a professional visual development artist and working as a digital artist in animation. Because this kind of work is basically your life. This is what you do on your 9 to 5. Is this kind of creative thinking, creative problem solving, and then no one ever sees this. This stuff it never makes the light of day. You design it, and then you pass on the designs that were born from this kind of work. So I know quite a few artists who delete all of this stuff, so they don't even keep it. They kind of treat it almost like a warm-up exercise, and then obviously the stuff that has to be passed forward gets passed forward. But generally, they'll yeah, they won't keep any of these kind of sketches. I know other artists who keep everything, who just have notepads and notepads and notepads full of this kind of design research, where they're just toying with lots of different ideas. And oddly enough, like historically, when you think of like legendary visual development artists and designers, people like Mary Blair, for example, it's all of these like weird little sketches that are now lauded over and that people are always kind of on the hunt for and always really excited to be the proud owner of. Okay, so I'm just going to draw one more of these in because I want to have a bit of something to kind of draw a comparison with. I'm just going to draw another one. You'll notice they're not all exactly the same. There is a reason for that. That's simply because they wouldn't naturally occur the same. I think even when you clone stuff, like when you do, you kind of copy and paste things, always keep a little bit of variation. You should warp things ever so slightly. I could have just drawn one and then just done a copy and paste exercise, but then it's not always accurate. You'll have a fresh way of thinking about something when you're working on a slightly different version of that challenge. Okay, so here's kind of my three shapes, and I said they were going to be trees, didn't I? So now we need to start thinking about all right, what's a tree got? Well, a tree has got roots. It's got a trunk. It's got branches. It's got leaves. It's got like a foliage. Um, it's got bark. So all of these kind of basic components we can start thinking of. I'm going to create another layer here. Just going to move this one below. The reason it's below is then I can design without having to worry too much about drawing over. I'm kind of keeping the core shapes in. So yeah, when we think about this object, we can start to, just going to lower the opacity on these ever so slightly. There we go. Yeah, we can start to think about like how this shape would inform all of those components. So we could say that this is the kind of silhouette of the tree, in which case that all we'd need to do is like, just bang in a trunk. There you go, and there's your tree shape potentially. We could have it actually that it's much shorter and that it's like that. There's the trunk. That's it. There it is. We could go for something much taller, or even we can start to think creatively. Like, okay, well maybe this is maybe it's shaped more like that. Yeah, maybe there's a greater extension before we get to the foliage. So straight away, just in thinking, okay, like if that's the body, how do we apply the other components? Straight away, we've got three very different pieces of design here, and we can keep kind of playing around with these. We can keep kind of having different attempts at this. What if it is like that, like this, perhaps, maybe a bit thinner, but it's more like this, kind of come upward, perhaps. So now we've got something much stronger coming in, something that's visually much stronger. So we could do it that way. We could start to think about, I'm going to rub this one out. Yeah, this idea of like multiples coming in. And even adding kind of stylization that way. So all of these are just they're all following the same rule. They're all kind of working on this same principle of that it's the body. Yeah, that the body of the tree is like, or the core silhouette of the tree is this fundamental shape that we've chosen, and then we just add the next component on top. But then there's other ways you could do it. Now we could say, okay, well that's fine. But what if there's no uniformity? And what if actually this shape is supposed to make up, a whole kind of bunch of components within the larger shape? So the final silhouette of this tree isn't this shape, isn't this kind of quadrilateral shape that we've created. What if it's just one of the pieces that informs it? So let's go up. What do we mean by that? Well, this is our shape just here. That doesn't help. Let's get an actual proper color. There we go. So there's that kind of fundamental shape that we chose. But what if we kind of played around with the fact that it was a multitude of these shapes together that kind of formed the basis of our, of our tree? Maybe another one. Yeah, got how liberal I got there with that design. Yeah, so is it maybe it's something that's more complex than that? Yeah, maybe it's not as simple as a single shape or a single line informing our tree. Maybe it's that it makes up a component of it. Right, so now we've got something that's very, very different. We can start even kind of bringing some out here. Maybe put another one there. And another one kind of in the background just here. Yeah, just like a... So now we've got some really kind of interesting shapes going on. But they're all built around that same kind of fundamental idea, that kind of same one singular shape in the base. Yeah, that it's this shape that builds everything. This shape here. What if it's that though it forms the body, there's no uniformity in the object itself? So what do we mean by that? Well, let's say that one tree is one shape. So we're kind of taking a step backwards here. So saying this one of these kind of four-sided shapes, that's one tree. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be uniformity in that. You could have another one up here that's much shorter and fatter, and we could do one in front of it that's kind of taller and thinner, and maybe another one here that's kind of a middling shape like this. Another one up here that's almost identical but just not quite. So you can see how I'm starting to sort of overlap these slightly. And the reason I'm doing that is because now we can say, well, now a foliage of trees, like an outline of trees would have a shape that looks like this. So now we've got lots of these shapes kind of together, all forming a single identity. Some are in the foreground, some are in the background, but they're not uniform in their design. That's the important part. Is though we've chose the same shape, we've allowed them to kind of slip into each having kind of their own visual identity, like so. And this is still, I think, what's important to remember at this stage is we are now still only kind of thinking about the idea of silhouette. We're not getting too kind of caught up on this. We're still just thinking about like the outline of something. We could have that it's just you're limiting. You're saying, okay, so every tree is made of 3 pieces. 1, 2, we'll put the third one there. But every tree must have 3 of these shapes. And it looks something like that. So you create this hard rule that, it doesn't matter what order that they go in, they just have to have 3 shapes. You could have another one that's like much, much taller. Little one there. And a little one there. That's that tree. I'm going to do the same principle just here, but this time I'm going to put the kind of the big one at the 4. This is the same principle as the previous sketch that I just did. But now I'll put the other ones in the background. So I'll put one there. And one there. Again, so I've kept to the same rules. I've still got, that shape's in the background just there, and that shape's in the background just there, but I've removed those and I've kept my kind of main shape in the foreground. And again, I'm still applying this same sense of stylization. And this is just all coming off of the rectangle shape. Or the four, it was born from a square. The same principle applies to the other shapes as well. It absolutely applies to the other shapes as well. So let's get rid of all of these. Okay, so there's my kind of, well, that's not quite a circle. It wasn't a bad effort, but I've done better. Yeah, I like that. So yeah, we can start with the same principle as a circular shape and then start to squeeze it or press. So what if we kind of pressed it into a shape that was more like that, for example? Then we can start to apply exactly the same principle. So put one there. Apologies again that these aren't perfect, but I should do my very best. So we could say, okay, yeah, like, the basics is, ta-da, it's a tree. Or we could go slightly smarter with it. So we could do something that's like thin. Yeah, and have that kind of Ivan Earl, almost like a lift like that. So it's designed more like this. Or we could keep it really, really short. So on this one here, you could just be like, that's it. That is the silhouette, the shape of these trees. But actually, you need to be a little bit smarter than that. We can start to apply just what we did with the rectangle or the quadrilateral shape. We can start to apply exactly the same principles here. So we could take this one and go, okay, what if we did it? Choose there, and then straight away, it doesn't matter like what you really do with the trunk. Straight away, that's a more interesting design for a tree. Yeah, we've got the beginnings of something really, really interesting. Or you could say, okay, all the trees kind of have that shape. So we've got same principle again, like with the idea of a lineup. So you have like one's kind of like that, but the one next to it is kind of a slightly different shape, and then the one behind it's like a massive one that's a lot more rounded, and then you've maybe got a smaller one here and a little one there, and actually all of them together, that's your kind of foliage of trees. That's a background one. This one by and large is in the background as well, so we'll just sort of color that one in a bit. So that's the kind of principle we're talking about here. It's like you're applying shapes and the same logic to them, and these are still just silhouettes. You know, I think that's really important. Let's think about that idea, because we did talk a little bit earlier about being really dramatic and manipulating the shapes. We talked about like a shape that was kind of more like that. So we're still taking the kind of shape of starting with a circle, but warping it into something else. And principally that applies as well, you know, and you could use that shape to form. So I'm just going to create a couple of versions of this. Apologies for how rough this is. But yeah, and you could use that as the basis to build a tree design as well. There you go, like that. Maybe another one, kind of low down just here. But it's still, you know, principally, it's the same thing as what you were doing before. You're starting with that fundamental shape, and then you're using that to inform everything else within the design. Okay, and we are still just in silhouette. This is not even about color. This is not about form and structure or anything like that yet. You know, still very, very, very much around silhouette. Okay, so this is what you would normally do with that idea of stylization, is you would do pages and pages of these. Just this principle of taking the shape and putting it out, I'll do it with the other ones as well. So we had, I think I'll probably flatten this just for effect. I'm just going to flatten these out a little bit. So one here, one here. We'll do a bigger one there with maybe one over the top of it like that, and then a smaller one just here. So this is the four-sided shape, and again you can just use, say, like, okay, so it's not the whole form now. It's more like the foliage, the separate foliage of the tree. Yeah, but you can create something that kind of looks like that, perhaps. It doesn't have to be that separated as well. You could do it really kind of close together and intensely. So you could kind of grab loads of these shapes. Sorry, I'm getting really kind of rough and sketchy now, but this is generally how I work. I work on, yeah. So you can see what I've done here is I've kept that same shape, but I've started to manipulate it ever so slightly. Apologies, we've just lost our connection there. Let's go back to that. There we go. Yeah, so I'm kind of still playing around with this idea, but this time what I've done is I've warped that shape. Yeah, I've kind of turned it in different directions. So you'll notice with all the other ones, all of the shapes kind of face in the same direction. Yeah, everything's kind of facing the same way. With this one, I've got lots of different kind of shapes happening. Well, not shapes, sorry. I've got lots of different directions happening with this one. And then again, I think this one would work really well with that kind of a dropped spot look. Yeah, something like that. So yeah, it's really, really stylized, but it is that beginnings is very humble. It does come from like these kind of core shapes, these kind of fundamental shapes. So this is kind of the sketching exercise that you should be going through when you're thinking about, like, okay, what is the style of my animation? You know, what's the aesthetic of all of these objects? And then we can start to actually transcend the same principles into the other shapes and stuff that we would see. So what we mean by that is, let's say that this shape, yeah, so this kind of four-sided, sorry, I'm drawing super rough now. It's the problem when you're talking and sketching at the same time. The four-sided shape, let's say that's our kind of design shape that we're going to work from. If you're working on a composition, I'm going to just kind of create something. I'll do something relatively quick here just to kind of emphasize my point. So I'm just going to draw it in a box because everything works better for me when it's in a box. Let's say we've got like something really simple, like we've got like a valley, and then we've got a mountain, and we've got a road like this that our character walked down, and then here in the road we've got a tree. So there's a tree here. Okay, if we've decided that that rectangle is our fundamental shape for our tree, and we kind of put that in there, and we say, right, that's the shape we're going for, and it's going to look kind of like this. Yeah, these are the shapes that we use in this animation, and that's just what it is. That's kind of the rules of this design. If that's what we're doing, what we cannot do, or what we should avoid to do, is then choose a different shape for this mountain. So if we went for some kind of like ultra spiky kind of, just really aggressive over the top shape for the mountain, like that, we've created something that is a completely different shape dynamic. If we did that, we've got two conflicting pieces of design. We've got soft, smooth shapes in one part, and then we've got these kind of hard, aggressive shapes in another part, and it just won't work at all. So we have to be very, very conscious of that, of like whatever you pick for your stylization, that's the kind of rule that you have to stick to. If you pick this kind of soft shape, if that is the beginnings, then fine. It doesn't have to be. Like, there's some great bits of design that have used other shapes. I'm not going to get too into it, but my kids are really big on My Little Pony. And in the current season of that on Netflix, the bad guys are like these kind of evil ponies. And they've gone for this design shape that's really interesting because it's like a broken, kind of like a bubbled like spike like this. And within that, it's got like holes in it, like it's kind of partially formed. It's almost like made of oil. Really, really interesting design aesthetic. And yeah, so this is kind of like this really spiky shape they've gone for, but it works and it's everywhere. It's in everything to do with those characters. It's in the design of the characters themselves. It's in the aesthetic of their their clothes, like the sort of clothing and the decorations they have around their bodies, the place that they live. Everything is designed around this really extreme shape, and that's the kind of principles that we should be applying with this. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at now, before I want to give you some stuff to start doing and start working through, is going inside that shape, and what do we actually mean when we start to think about form and structure, and how do we kind of manage that? So let's which is important. So white screens really, really matter for this kind of work because I'm working specifically in color. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my painting. I want to pick something that's kind of really hard. Awesome. That will do. Lovely. Oops. Let's get rid of that. And then I'm going to go for green. I'm not going to overthink too much. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay in kind of the kind of basic silhouette for this. So yeah, that's better. Awesome. It's kind of something like that, isn't it? And then what I'm going to then do is just go in and kind of clean this up a little bit, get that language as I want it, so the shape language. Okay, that's not too bad. I'm going to square this off a little bit, like so. Yeah, I'm kind of with that. And then I'm going to just go in with a brown color. And then with this brown, I'm just going to make a very clear decision about design. So make that much smaller. I think I'm going to go in like this. Just for that moment, okay. So I'm going to stick with this for the moment. This is kind of the beginnings. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to start thinking about actually playing around with the form and the structure and like how this shape is made and what the rules are for the inside of the shape. So the way I tend to do this, I'm just going to put an alpha lock on. Now you can do the same thing in Photoshop down in the bottom right hand corner in the layers section. You can put an alpha lock in. What this does just prevents me from kind of working outside of the space and allows me to, well, you'll see, look, if I start painting, can you see how it only impacts what's inside the shape? Yeah, really handy. So within that will just allow me to now go in and start just putting a bit of depth on this. Remember I said it was a three-dimensional shape. Like so, and then I'll probably do, let's go same color and bring it down a little bit. There we go. So I'm just kind of like putting these little splodges in just to create kind of a sense of depth. And then I'll do the same down here with the brown. I'm just going to lift that up, make the brush way smaller. Actually, the first thing I'm going to do, too far. Go back to the source color. So it's not going to be light under there, so it's going to look more like that. There we go. So this is kind of like the first step of now thinking about going inside this shape and making some decisions about like what that means for like fundamentals. Like so think about the idea of like form and structure. It's like, how dense is this object? Can I see through it? And if I can see through it, what implications does that kind of have for the design? So it might be that I want to start kind of almost going into it and like removing pieces and being like, okay, so there's like maybe a gap here, and there's a gap there perhaps. And then towards the top, we can start maybe cutting pieces out. You could even like put in a little bit like that. Almost leave that one actually. It's just work. It'll just work here. Yeah, and it seems quite extreme, but this is a really good way to get a kind of grounded feel within your work. Yeah, just sort of like taking little pieces of it almost, and not even like just chip away at that corner. So we still know what it's going to look like. It's just ever so slightly kind of frayed a little bit. Right, so and then into that, I'm just going to turn off the alpha lock, and then into that, I'm just going to sample. Let's make that smaller. And then I'll tend to work on a layer below for this, and then I'll merge the two. So I'll kind of like do things like I'll just like paint in yeah, just little bits of information to say like, yeah, there's a branch here. Might even go for a really small, like little flick like that. So what we're doing here is we're just kind of building this sense of like identity, that it is. Okay. Even have like little twigs just coming through. So I'm just kind of working through it and making some clear decisions about like it's how it kind of works as a shape. And already it's still built on those fundamentals. It's still conforming to the rules of the design. It's just doing so in a way that still adds a sense of realism. So what I would tend to do now is like, okay, this is my first attempt at the tree with these rules applied. So let's say my rule is that like the fundamental shape is the whole body. That's the rule. Um, what I'll then do is think, okay, what about if it's more complex? Like, what if it's not as simple as it just being flat? What if that doesn't work? So let's we'll merge those two together. I'm just going to push this over to one side here, and then I'll create a new layer. And then on that layer, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to my green. Make sure it's that same brush I was using, which it is lovely. And then this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint in the same shape. But now I'm going to start to think a bit more three-dimensionally. It's like, okay, what if we are perhaps kind of looking up at it, maybe, or it's so tall. Yeah, let's go for it. It's so tall that we are having to kind of look up at it. So just filling in that information, and then with the eraser, which I'll make a little bit larger. This time I'm going to keep that. Go. It's really nice. Maybe just level it out a little bit. So now it seems odd that I've kind of gone in quite aggressively with that. And then up here, yeah, not too bad. Okay, same principle now being applied. I'm going to put that alpha lock on. Luckily, I've got a lot of my colors are kind of stored here, so I can go in with some of those other colors. You can see now what I'm doing. I'm thinking much more three-dimensionally about this, and this is I'm still thinking pretty quickly. Like I'm still very much thinking on my feet with this. So I'm like tapping the crest on that just to really kind of let's bring it down, bring that up. Yeah, really kind of where I can. Bring that out, and then at the bottom probably need to. You can't have it as kind of strong at the bottom. Like it almost needs to blur, almost kind of needs to merge together. Not quite, but just kind of the beginnings of that. So just dotting some darker patches around, and then on this side, same principle applies. Not a lot, but just these kind of little dabs of slightly darker. So what I'm doing here is creating a sense of depth. Yeah, now I'm working on a shape that's a little bit more kind of sensible in its construction. So I'll try and feather it a little bit. go. And then same principle, so I'll go I'll create a new layer, I'm going to pop this one underneath, because now the part of the reason I'm doing this is for my my trunk. And the reason I've dropped this on a layer below is because we are looking down at the bottom of this tree, so this section here, we're looking down at it, so it makes sense to just not even risk anything kind of going wrong with the trunk. So just placing the trunk make sure. Yeah, so I put a new layer in. Yeah, and you'll see now it sits behind that. So that's something to avoid as well. Avoid hitting those tangent lines too hard. Okay, so what do I mean by those tangent lines? Well, just yeah, try not to. This area. It's very difficult to show you. Where lines cross over. So you've got a line here, for example. I might just I've got this on a new layer, haven't I? Yeah. Let's just switch to like a super obvious pen. Good pen, come on. A gel pen, there we go, right. You can hear that? There's an ice cream van outside. So I've got, this is a tangent line just here. So it's the corner of the tree, it's just there. And what I don't want to do is, okay, so let's go back here, get the right brush up, sample that. And then I might actually go in, there we go. So I'm just trying to kind of clean that up as best I can, and not overreach too much. Like I think that bit there is an overreach. There we go. All right. So from here, principally the same things now kind of apply. So I'm going to come up, make this bigger. I'm going to set this to have an alpha lock as well. There we go. And I can start putting in kind of some of those stronger bits. I want to overdo this actually. So I'm going to lower that opacity right down. A bit of catch there, but that's about it. And then we'll have darker patches. Darker than that, I think. Here I have some darker patches under there. A darker patch there, like so. I think that's probably a bit too much. So in the center. So I'm just gonna kind of thin it out. And then I'll go and do exactly the same thing that I did before. So go in with my eraser, make it a bit smaller, and just kind of chisel a few pieces out. Normally it's near the edges. It's you wouldn't normally have like any big pieces sort of chiseled out dead center. Like that doesn't really make sense. in terms of like design. Like you wouldn't just have like a massive chunk missing out of the middle there. Doesn't it, like that's not how a tree works. A tree kind of thins towards its edges, so you might get like a little bits here and little bits there that are just that kind of little bit thinner. You might have some near the bottom, but probably not too much. So I might put like one bit there, for example. I'm going to try not to overdo it either. Like you can overcook it. Someone once said to me, you just sometimes you just draw too much. Like it goes too far, and I think you've always got to be really wary of that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, yeah, and just sort of put those lines in. I had to take off the alpha lock because I'm adding new information, so I can just draw those in. So just adding. Yeah, so all this does is it just adds a sense of depth. It just helps you understand that this tree is a three-dimensional object. Like it does exist. It occupies space almost, and I think that really matters. I quite like doing this. I like kind of bits now. Just maybe cut that. We have it. We've got one that is absolutely just a flat object, and then we've got one that has a little bit more dimension to it. We're starting to think three-dimensionally, and that's kind of the next stage for you. Is starting to think about carrying your work forward, so that it has a stylization. Like there's some clear rules, but the way that that is achieved is by working through this kind of activity. So I'm just going to take a few steps backwards here. Let's combine those two. Let's make these invisible. Let's go right back to the beginning. So you must already know how to do this stuff. You must know composition. You must know basic shape dynamics. You better be able to draw by this point. And then frame and form and structure. So how something is made and what the reason is for the structure of certain objects. So that needs to be just done and nailed. Then we start with this idea of begin like a child. Think about this like a child. Start with very, very basic shapes and then add different levels of manipulation. So thinking about warping them one stage at a time. So don't jump from this straight down to this. Okay, it's too much. Stagger your way through it. Make these subtle changes along the way. So this is a world away from a circle, but you have to kind of work towards it. So think about that. Like what work for my design, for the things that I'm trying to say and the stories I'm trying to tell. And then from that to the next stage is we have to then take whatever our chosen shape is and really get our head around its dynamics. So what does it look like three-dimensionally? How does it work in a space? Yeah, so start sketching out that shape and learn it, know it, so that you can confidently draw it. And then our next stage is like the beginnings of setting the rules for how that shape is then applied. So we went with the bottom level of technique here, which was just the form. Like that squared shape or that quadrilateral shape was the entirety of the set, and that's fine. You can start with that process, just like I've done in this demo. So that was the next step here. But then we can think about it in more complex terms. We can think about it in terms of like how they all work together. Can you start applying them over the top of one another to create kind of complex compositions? So this one here was a great example of that shape used multiple times to create a form. Or do you create variation of the form in order to create a bigger piece of compositional content? So lots of trees, but all different versions of that same fundamental shape. Or do you set a hard rule? So each object, so a tree, for example, is made of 3 of these fundamental shapes. So there was one, and that was the one version, and that was a different version as well. Just kind of setting those very, very clear kind of rules. And then we talked about like how that would apply kind of quite liberally. So this was examples of like then applying it quite spread apart. So it's not the whole form, but it's this shape makes up a part of that object. So this bean shape that was born from a circle makes up the foliage of a tree, or even more stylized, this square quadrilateral shape makes up the foliage of a tree, but they all faced in the same direction. Or we go really wild with it and we start moving them all in different directions. And we remember, never cross your themes over. Whatever style you choose, whatever fundamental shape you pick, you stick to it. Even if they're variations of it like this, you still stick to it all the way through. And then from that, we get to this point where we can start to think about form, and we can start to think about how these shape dynamics work when we begin to paint them into our structures. So this is just assets. This isn't even about painting visual development pieces or concept art. This is about just understanding what the shapes and the stylization rules are for the objects that would be then put into your paintings and into your designs. So I was just some quick examples of films where this has been really, really well. I did have one, I think it was up here, here we are. Yeah, so Zach Retz's work for Scoob, so the new Scooby-Doo movie. This is on iamag.co, which is its art magazine. What's really interesting about this is obviously Scooby-Doo is like mysteries and solving crimes, and it's always supernaturally kind of based, isn't it? There's something supernatural going on, which would naturally be scary. But one of the interesting things about this film is all of the shapes in it are very rounded. So even though the content very, very soft squares, so really soft quadrilateral shapes and really round shapes, even in the kind of scary stuff. So like this is a great look at this shark. Like it's so rounded. It's not jagged and angular. It kind of keeps these kind of very rounded shapes. So I thought this was a great example of that kind of shape rule coming in. Look at the this castle on the cliff top. Even though it's got these jagged shapes up in the top of the peaks of the roof, the actual mountain itself is made of lots of rounded squares. Yeah, so they all kind of form together. The mystery machine here, the van, is rounded. That's what we're talking about here. There's another example of that rounded shape. It's with the mystery machine. So like if we've got a rule for design, can we make sure that we kind of stick to that rule and we apply it? Other ones I can show you. So production art, one of the most obvious historical examples is Sleeping Beauty, and it's Ivan Earle's work. Let's see if I can find some here. This is all like the actual animated frames, which is quite frustrating. This is from Living Lines Library, by the way. I really do encourage people to go and check it out. Production art. Let's see if they've got any Sleeping Beauty here. They've got some of the backgrounds from Sleeping Beauty. Oh, actually, I can show you some stuff here. Sorry. Let's go back. This board, Pinterest obviously is your friend. This is Celia Casper's board, collection of art, animation art boards, and she's got a great example here. These are good. So this is visual development just for plants, and some fantastic examples. This is some hyper stylized stuff. This is by Lisa Keane for Frozen. Absolutely exceptionally stylized work, and look how it's built on different fundamental shapes. You've got some that are built on these soft cloud shapes at the top left hand corner. This I just zoom, I don't know if it'll let me zoom in. Yeah, so from the top left hand corner you've got like these intense cloud shapes through to triangles, and then by the time you get to the bottom everything's built off of a circle. So that's yeah, good example. I love this. This looks like Ivan Earle, yeah, built off of rectangles just here. In fact, I can show you, Ivan Earle pretty much wrote the book on this level of stylization. Here's some more great examples of trees built. This is Paul Felix's work. So we've talked about Paul Felix before, who I kind of consider to be probably the greatest visual development artist ever. Yeah, so this is a good example of using squares and rectangles to build those shapes. So yeah, there's lots of examples out there, but I think it's really important to remember that pretty much all film work is built on these kind of principles. Okay, so you should be building your action. So these are my boards, and I keep a story art and visual development board. Let's find it. There it is. And then within, yeah, story art and visual development, in the keyframes, I tend to keep a lot of these kind of stylized pieces where you can see kind of clear shapes being used. This is a good example. So How to Train Your Dragon uses lots of jagged edges, like sharp edges and sharp corners. Um, Up was built heavily on rectangles. Even the shape of his head is rectangular. It like lots of squares and rectangles, four-sided shapes, and parallel-sided shapes was kind of a fundamental component of that. So these are the things we're looking for when we're designing. It's like, what is that? What is the rule here? What's the hard stylization of that which we're trying to create? So your turn. I'd like to see everyone kind of have a crack at this. Pick a shape and go through the motions of applying that shape as a stylization rule for the work that you're going to create. And then, yeah, I'll create a little upload space. I'll put some resources up on Moodle for you to take a look at, especially for Ivan Earl and some of his stuff. So you can see this work at like a super high polished level. So Ivan Earl works on a lot of the golden age, like Disney films, for example, really, really heavily stylized visual development work. And then think about beginning that application to your work. So third year students, you're on your major project now. Is there a clear style rule for the backgrounds of your shots? You put a lot of focus into animation. How well and how intensely are you focusing on the stylization and the style rules of the work that you're creating? Okay, and then for second year students with your projects as well, like have you applied that same level of thinking? And if not, is there time now to go back and start to apply some clear stylization rules, whatever they might be, to your work? So what we're going to do in the next session, we're going to look at actually bringing stylization into full visual development concepts. So it's a bit of a merging of some of the concept painting we've done before, the master study stuff we've done before, the stylization stuff we're doing now, and then bringing all that together to begin to kind of start to create our own complex, stylized, and good visual development paintings.